While we're queuing this up, I'm Edward Hudgins. I'm the research director at the Heartland Institute. I've worked at the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute and Atlas Society as an Atlas Shrugged. And I've been writing about, among other things, FDA for quite a few years. So I'm really happy that we're in a situation now. And this is the thing. I was writing about this decades ago, and we're now in a situation where things can be done and are being done. And so that's what really is exciting right now about where we are. So I want to basically do 3 or 4 things here. And I want to start by saying that we're going to present, which we do in this book, Free to Choose Medicine. I urge everybody to read it. We're going to talk about the free to choose medicine approach to breaking through these problems that Grace, Marie, and Steve have talked about. And in the sense, there was a precedent set when we had the AIDS crisis in the 1980s for free to choose medicine. Just to fill in, we've already heard about this a little bit, but the FDA started actually in the early 1900s and grew in power. And by the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, it was requiring phase 1 safety tests, which, move along fairly quickly. And then efficacy tests, phase 2 and 3, which take years and years and years. And of course, we want medicine to be safe and effective, but we also need it in a timely manner. And even back then, even before the AIDS crisis, for example, there was research done that showed that beta blockers, which was something that could prevent people from dying from heart attacks and heart disease, was available in England. But not available in the United States because FDA was sitting on it. And one estimate is that 100,000 people died during those years who might have been saved by beta blockers. Interleukin-2 was something for kidney problems. And again, one estimate back then was that some 25,000 people may have died whose lives might have been saved if they had had access to interleukin-2 when it was accessible overseas, not in the United States. Just to show you where the FDA was back in those days, there was a test kit. I think this was actually for AIDS in the 80s. And it basically was a urine sample cup. And the FDA wanted to classify it as Class C medical device, which is the same category as heart valves. There's actually a lawsuit, and fortunately the FDA lost that one. But it gives you an idea of the bureaucratic mentality. So this is where the situation was in the 1980s. When the AIDS epidemic broke out in this country. Of course, AIDS was an unknown disease at the time, unlike cancer and other diseases. And at its height, there were 75,000 cases of new infections per year. And at its height, in the early 90s, 50,000 people were dying of AIDS each year. And to put that in perspective, that's almost as many people as died, Americans who died during the Vietnam War. That was the kind of crisis situation we're in, and there was no cure in sight. Well, fortunately, people who were affected by AIDS didn't sit and die quietly. They said, we're not going to put up with this. We're not going to wait years because we can't wait years. So patients mobilized their own networks, exchanging information. This was pre-internet too, by the way, folks. They had to, if any of you saw the movie Dallas Buyers Club, they basically would pass around medicines and say, this one seems to work and so forth. They created their own networks because the FDA was just too darn slow. They actually had protests. They occupied the FDA building up here in Montgomery County, Maryland, in the I think it was the early 90s, around 89, 90. And they got Congress to put pressure on the administration. Henry Waxman, Democrat, by the way, led the way on this to do something. Well, what came out of it was this, the parallel track. And what happened was very important. The National Health Service, part of HHS, posted a notice of a regulatory change in the Federal Register. They didn't go through Congress. They said, we can do this with our own change. They posted in 1990 and said, we propose a parallel track. And after all the comments came in, et cetera, it was approved in 1992. And what it did was this. It said, after a drug has passed through a drug meant to treat AIDS has passed through those safety tests, the drug sponsor can apply to the FDA, and if the FDA says okay, it goes on a parallel track, meaning that not only the few patients who are in clinical trials can access it, it means that others can access it as well. Now, there were a lot of qualifications for who could access it, but this was during the phase 2 and phase 3 tests. Because normally, you know, if you're not in the clinical trials, well, too bad, you got to wait, and, you know, maybe you'll survive, maybe you won't. And what happened was, in 1992, right after this this parallel track was approved, FDA allowed stavudine to go on that track, meaning that even though it was not passing the efficacy tests, it in fact could be accessed. During the time from 1992 to late 1995, while it was still in test and before the FDA gave final approval, 12,000 individuals were allowed to access that drug who otherwise would not have accessed it, who probably would have been dead. So this certainly extended their lives. Just one example of the life-saving of having this parallel track. Basically, with another drug that had been approved as well in a different way, deaths dropped from 50,000 a year down to about 20,000 per year in the couple of years that followed. Today, there's deaths from AIDS per year are only about 16,000, still too high. But that shows you what this parallel track did with just one drug. Now, what's interesting is, of course, if you look at the public comments, and I read through all of these in the Federal Register, one of the first things at the top where people were saying, if you can do this for AIDS, why can't you do it for other ailments? And the FDA and the government argued, well, this is kind of a pilot project. We don't want to do it right now, but because other people were concerned. And let's take a look at, just for example, today. I mentioned 50,000 people were dying of AIDS at the top, at its peak. Today, 5 million people suffer from Alzheimer's, and there are 100,000 deaths per year. This is just one disease. Alzheimer's by 2025 is going to affect 7 million Americans, 8.4 million by 2030, 16 million Americans by 2050. One estimate I saw said that the annual cost in 2007 for Alzheimer's, this includes not only patients but the caregivers and so forth, is $259 billion a year. And there's no cure in sight. That's just one disease. I could do the whole thing for cancer and for a whole lot of other diseases. So you say, well, why didn't the FDA move ahead and say, we want to have a parallel track for all drugs? Well, what ended up happening is, instead of doing a parallel track for all drugs, they basically said, well, we're going to come up with these other approaches. We're going to have an accelerated approval approach, a priority review approach, which basically is the drug company pays a fee to the FDA essentially to do what it's already paid to do, and it shaves 3 or 4 months off of the approval process. And there's a fast track approach, and there's a breakthrough approach, and there's right to try, which we've heard a little bit about already, and there's compassionate use. Now, I'm not going to describe all this to you because it is kind of a spaghetti network of, well, you can try this and try that, and you can combine this and combine that. It's very confusing, frankly. Drug manufacturers and developers have to get consultants to say, okay, so how do I want to do all this kind of stuff? It's still confusing. And even though FDA says, see all the nice things we've done, but it still takes 10 to 12 years at a cost of about $2.6 billion to bring a product from lab to the market. So all of these things don't seem to be working right. So do we have a better option? Well, we do. That's why we're here. Free to choose medicine, the free to choose medicine track, I think really kind of perfects the concept that was floating around with the parallel track. First of all, free to choose medicine, what happens is after phase 1 safety tests and at least one phase 2 test or trial, so we make sure that it's a promising drug, the drug manufacturer or sponsor can put it on the free to choose medicine track. FDA doesn't have to approve it. There will be there is a review panel that will make sure that they've in fact passed the phase 1 test and 1 phase 2 test. But once they do that, it's not the FDA's choice, it's the drug manufacturer's choice. All drugs can go on there, not just AIDS drugs, Alzheimer's, cancer, whatever. The drug sponsor decides. And they can charge. They can charge market prices. This is very important because you see a lot of very innovative small drug labs that are coming up with interesting things. But the thing is, they can't wait and take $2.6 billion in cost. And so they often either go out of business or they get bought up by one of the big companies. And, well, it might preserve them, but again, it's a bureaucracy, and that's always a problem even with private companies. So by cutting the costs and by allowing them to charge, well, now the innovative companies have an even better opportunity to do something. And it's the doctors and the patients who decide that they want to try a medication on the free-to-choose medicine track rather than maybe wait for another 3, 4, 5, however many years for something to go through the normal FDA process. And this is the little diagram here of how it works. Now, one of the most important parts of the free-to-choose medicine track is the trade-off evaluation drug database. Now, when the parallel track was being debated, there was a lot of pushback saying, well, this is going to interfere with the clinical trials where you have a placebo group that doesn't get the product. You get the test group that does get the product. They're blind, double-blind tests, and you do this kind of thing. And there was a lot of concern about, well, how do you certify the efficacy of a product without double-blind tests? TED is a really great answer. What happens is if anybody who accesses a drug on the free-to-choose medicine track, their information has to be deposited in a database, privacy protected, of course. So you get all their particulars, you know, man, woman, what is the age, do they have some other ailment, do they have diabetes, have they ever had cancer, all of those sorts of information, as well as their experience with the drug that's being tested there. This is called real-world data. Okay, it's the best example I heard is it's like the difference between studying a tiger in a zoo and studying a tiger in the wild. Where are you going to really learn about the tiger? I call it like a Yelp for medicine. That's another good analogy. And this can either supplement or maybe even be an alternative to the clinical trials. Because ultimately, by the way, the FDA does, you have provisional approval of things that go on the parallel track, or the free-to-choose medicine track. Ultimately, the FDA does have to approve it, okay? But this gives not only an incentive for labs and developers to come out with innovative drugs, it gives them an incentive to come out with innovative ways to certify the efficacy of drugs. This is very, very important. I'll say a few words about that when I wrap up in just a minute or two here. And by the way, this is not something that's completely unique. First of all, many drugs, I think I've seen the number 50%, I don't have the numbers right here, are actually used for what's called an off-label use, meaning the FDA approves it for one thing, doctors, physicians, hospitals discover it can be used for something else. And even though it is a crime for the manufacturer to tell the doctors that, oh yeah, this can be used for something else, well, they do it anyway. And the best example was, you probably know, years ago, all physicians knew that aspirin could help prevent heart attacks and serious heart problems. Okay, taking an aspirin. But because the FDA had not approved aspirin for that reason, doctors could talk among themselves, they could publish articles and all, but if the manufacturer of aspirin went to a doctor and said, yes, it can be used for that, then it could be hauled away to jail because the FDA said they couldn't say that yet. And finally, that was approved. But the point is, off-label use is kind of real-world data, trying to sort out what works, what doesn't work, what works for whom. Another example, right now the FDA has a system in place where they track drugs after they've been approved, because the FDA always wants to update the labels. So they have to say, oh, well, now in the real world we find that it doesn't quite work for this, so we're going to change the label and say, you know, if you have this thing and if you're under 4 years old and da-da-da-da-da. So they already have a system where they're kind of doing this, right? And another example, there is a medical device information consortium that is in the process, a public-private consortium. It's going to be fully operational, I think, in about a year. And it's to track medical devices after they've been approved. And by the way, patient groups were very strongly behind this because they said, for medical devices, we need to get the real experience after they're on the market to see what works best and so forth. So in a sense, this process is already working. This trade-off evaluation drug database is incredibly important for future medicine development. Now, I want to put this in a wider context, global context. We're arguing that this can be done, and by the way, it doesn't take legislation. Legislation would be nice, but the parallel track was done through a regulatory change. You can do the same thing with free-to-choose medicine. But this isn't a situation in isolation. Let's take a look at the global situation. Japan has the oldest average population in the world and has the greatest longevity. Okay, that's the good news. Of course, what it also means is that with the aging population, they need to get a system in place so that medication, especially for the aging population, can be approved quicker. So a couple of years ago, they essentially passed a free-to-choose medicine for their regenerative drugs. And what's interesting is we didn't even know this, that because Heartland had been working on this project, I guess it was 2007, something along those lines, we didn't know that a copy of this book, part of this book, got translated into Japanese. The Japanese took a look at it, said, hey, this is a good idea, let's give it a shot. And they did. At least for regenerative medicines, they now have a system in place that's the one I just described. And I know that at least 3 products have gone through that system already. So this is not just something that's nobody has ever tried before. Other countries are looking at doing exactly the same thing or variations of the same thing. China is doing some very interesting things. The UK, Israel. There's a favorite example I like from China. This is from last year. This is one of the reforms. There's a disease, multiple myeloma, I guess is how you pronounce it. And in China they used a technique called CAR-T treatments for this particular ailment, and it was, I think it was 100% successful for the first number of patients. And this is what's interesting, and this is from a report in the Financial Times. It said that the proliferation of CAR-T trials in China has benefited from a loophole in the regulations, as the therapy was classed as medical technology rather than a drug. Trials required only the permission of internal hospital ethics committees rather than China's Food and Drug Administration. And the medical committees only took 2 months as opposed to a couple of years. So the point is, China has been liberalizing, and they have something that's looking like the free-to-choose medicine, but they have a lot of other reforms where they basically say, okay, we've declared this something else, so instead of having to go through years of tests, an ethics board says, yeah, it looks good, let's give it a shot. So this is what's happening in the world today. This is not a discussion in a vacuum. I want to end, I always like to do the wow factor and end on sort of what the future could look like. This is a little girl, Leila Richards, and she was in England, and in 2005, she was under 1 year old. She had a form of cancer, and none of the treatments worked, and she was going to die. And they took donor cells, immune cells from a donor. They re-engineered those cells, and they injected them into little Leila Richards there, and it cured her cancer. She's cancer-free with genetic engineering. This is very interesting, too. This is an out-of-date slide because I used this a couple of years ago. In 2001, it cost $100 million to sequence a human genome. In 2007, it cost $10 million. A couple of years ago, when I started using this slide, it cost about $1,000. In yesterday's paper, you read the headline right there, $100 genome within reach. So it could be that in a very short period of time, your genome can be sequenced for only $100. What that means is that labs developing treatments now can think of how can we get a system in place where we look at your genome and we say, this is what's going to cure you, not everybody, not 15% of these people and 25% of these people, you. That's what's happening literally right now. This is another fascinating one. We know that aging and cancers and a number of other diseases are caused because if you have a chromosome here, right on the edges of the end of the chromosome is a thing called a telomere. And as the telomeres get shortened, the cells weaken, they don't reproduce, and that's why you wrinkle up and die, and that's why in many cases you get lots of diseases. And we know that there's an enzyme called telomerase, which keeps the little telomeres growing in the chromosomes. And last year, a lab in Paris decoded this enzyme. They sequenced the enzyme, essentially, telomerase. So now they can start looking at this enzyme and trying to figure out how can we take this enzyme and as it were, operationalize it so we can go and people who have certain diseases, we can go in there and simply put this enzyme in there and it'll take care of the problems. This is what the future could look like. We're talking about something that's not science fiction. But what we need is a real future 21st century approach to regulation. That is less regulation. That is a more open system. That is the free to choose medicine. What kind of a future do we want? I like to use this slide. This is how kids see the future. This is how adults see the future. I'm going to go for the top there. I want to see young people living to ripe old ages because, we really have gotten a medical revolution thanks to free to choose medicine. So thank you very much. And I guess turn it back over to you.